One, two, 1, 2, 3, 4.
Hey folks, it's Sam Jacobs. Welcome to the Sales Hacker Podcast. We have an incredible show for you this week. We have Alyssa Merwin, she's responsible for LinkedIn Sales Navigator, and she's VP of Sales Solutions for North America for LinkedIn. She runs a team of a couple hundred people. She is an incredibly accomplished and talented leader and manager and salesperson. And she has a lot to share with us about how you use trust and vulnerability and authenticity as a mechanism and as a driver to lead and manage high-performing sales teams. So it's a really, really good conversation, and it's a topic that we don't cover often enough on this show. Before we get there, we want to thank our sponsors. We've got two sponsors on the show for you today. We've got Conga. Conga is the leading end-to-end digital document transformation suite. With Conga, you can simplify documents, automate contracts, and execute e-signature so you can focus on accelerating sales cycles and closing business faster. Go to go.conga.com/saleshacker for more information. Our second sponsor is Outreach, the leading sales engagement platform. Outreach supports sales reps by enabling them to humanize communications at scale. From automating the soul-sucking manual work that eats up selling time to providing action-oriented tips on what communications are working best, Outreach has your back. Now, if you're out there and you're listening and you've been listening, one of the things we want to ask you to do is, can you please give us some feedback on iTunes, as long as it's very, very good feedback. So if you could give us a 4 or 5 star rating on iTunes, that'll help ensure that we get a high volume of great listeners on the show, and it'll help ensure that we can continue to provide the show to you. So if you like what you've been hearing, please rate us on iTunes, give us 4 or 5 stars. If you don't like what you've been hearing or listening, I don't know why you're listening now, but please don't do anything at all. Don't go to iTunes and don't give us any feedback. We only want positive feedback. Now, without further ado, let's listen to Alyssa Merwin. Hey everybody, it's Sam Jacobs, and welcome back to the Sales Hacker Podcast. We are honored today to have one of the people leading one of the most well-known companies in the sales space and obviously in the professional networking space, and that's Alyssa Merwin. Alyssa leads LinkedIn's Sales Navigator business for North America, one of LinkedIn's fastest growing businesses. In fact, every person that I know in Revenue Collective that talks about what's must-have in their tech stack, Sales Navigator is always part of it. She's responsible for leading a multi-100-person sales organization focused on providing a modern selling solution to sales executives at companies around the world. She's got deep experience in building high-performing sales teams, focusing on process, customer impact, and strong leadership and individual personal development. Prior to leading Sales Solutions, Alyssa led LinkedIn's North America search and staffing business, where she was responsible for all go-to-market teams. She previously led the part of the Talent Solutions sales organization. And before that, she spent her early career at Corporate Executive Board, CEB, which was acquired by Gartner, which wrote the Challenger Sale, and which is a best practices research and consulting firm. So, Alyssa, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
We are excited to have you. So I just read your bio. We like to start, as we do, with what we call the baseball card, which is really just a way of, as we say, contextualizing your background and your insights and your expertise. So first of all, what's your official title?
Official title will be Vice President, Sales Solutions, North America.
Awesome. And so you've been at LinkedIn. Obviously, I think we all know what LinkedIn is, et cetera. But it's always interesting to hear from the person that works at the company how you position LinkedIn. So how would you describe what LinkedIn does?
Yeah, so I would describe LinkedIn as the world's largest professional network with over 600 million members around the globe today, and a great platform for companies to help them to hire great talent, to market their products and services, to invest in learning for their employees, and then, of course, to provide what we like to think of as one of the most important sales solutions you can have for your business development.
Yeah, awesome. 600 million. That's a lot of people.
That's a lot of people.
So let's figure out how you got here, because how are you allowed to tell us how big the Sales Navigator business is roughly? What kind of guidance can you give us on sort of like the book of business that you're responsible for?
I don't know. I don't think we publicly report it, so I don't know how much I can share. But it's a large, very large business, and growing at a very healthy clip.
Very good. Very good. It's good.
It's not accurate.
We got to take what we can get when it's a public company. So Awesome. So let's go back a little bit to the beginning. So how did you get in? Walk us through a little bit of your background. How did you get into sales? If I was doing research on LinkedIn earlier, and it looks like you went to Smith College. Tell us about the sort of experience coming out of undergrad and how you got your start in this world of sales.
Yeah, it's funny. I hadn't thought about this until you just said the Smith part, but I guess this has come full circle. And when I think about how I ended up where I am, it really came down to the network. So when I was graduating from Smith, which is a wonderful liberal arts college with a double major in political science with a focus on sub-Saharan African politics and French.
Highly relevant, both
Yeah.
of those to sales.
I was very clear about nothing in terms of what I was going to do with my career. I actually thought I wanted to go into politics, perhaps into the foreign service or work in an NGO. And after a couple of internships, promptly decided that either NGO or government agencies, neither of those were the route I was going to take. So I decided I thought consulting felt like a really interesting place to go. And I had a couple of former Smithies who were at this somewhat small but fast growing company in Washington, D.C. called the Corporate Executive Board. And I reached out and they got me, helped me get my foot in the door. And the entry level role at CEB was a sales job. And so it was certainly not by design that I ended up in sales, but it was the fastest path into the company. And so that was how I landed my very first sales role, both through, network connection and then taking the first job that they offered me.
And what is, for those that don't know what CEB does, what does Corporate Executive Board do? What did they do? And you worked there for quite a while. Talk to us about sort of your journey through Corporate Executive Board and what your key takeaways were.
Yeah, it was such a fascinating place to start my career. So CEB has a model, or at least had a model, that was based on this premise that if you were a functional executive, so let's pick finance as an example. If you're a CFO of a company, regardless of the size of the company that you work for, regardless of the industry that you're in, where in the world you happen to be located, you're likely facing a set of shared challenges that many other CFOs face. And so rather than going out and hiring consulting firms or trying to come up with the answers on your own, why don't we pull the group to find out what are the actual best practices that others have already implemented? And let's go talk to those practitioners. Let's be able to document and codify what their process and approach was, bring it back to the members, and then allow everyone to benefit from that collective wisdom. And CEB did that across pretty much every functional area. So whether you're talking about HR or the IT space, legal, and it's a brilliant business model because you're tapping into the wisdom of the network to produce great outcomes for the benefit of everyone that's part of it. And so that's kind of the premise of the business. And then it expanded, of course, with some incredible thought leadership in places like Challenger. And, they're doing a lot more that's branched off from there, I think, in terms of professional services. But that's a headline.
And when you joined as a salesperson, were you doing outbound? Was there the concept of an SDR function? What were your initial set of responsibilities, and how did you evolve within CEB over the course of those years?
Yeah, so I was a BDR. That was the entry level role, and so I was paired up with a single account executive when we were buddies. I was there to support him, and my primary responsibility, so it tells you how far we're going back, was to cold call. In this case, my domain was finance. And by the way, this is coming from someone who specifically chose a liberal arts college that had no core curriculum so that I didn't have to take math or econ. And I found myself in the finance vertical. So it was a great education, whether I wanted it or not. But I was cold calling Fortune 500, Fortune 1000 executives in the finance space. So investor relations, treasurers, audit executives, controllers, and CFOs, and setting up appointments for the account executive that I was partnered with to go and meet with them live, because it was we had an incredibly effective sales process. So we were going out and selling, at the time, 5-figure solutions to a problem you probably didn't know you had before we walked in the door. And being able, in a lot of cases, to come out of the conversation with a signed contract, or not too long after, generally work through a sales cycle. It was pretty methodical, and it's such a great place to learn the art of sales. And so I was doing that, and I think, if I remember correctly, the the goal was to schedule 30 live meetings a month for the account exec.
Wow. That's a lot, actually, knowing meetings set. I mean, I guess there's a percentage that were held, et cetera, but that's still quite a lot. I mean, these are live in-person meetings.
Yeah, it was a lot. So, I mean, imagine how many cold calls you had to make.
You must have been very good at cold calling.
Well, it was very persistent.
While we've got you on this, and we may hear later on in the conversation that you're going to tell us cold calling is dead as a senior member of LinkedIn. But while you were doing it, what were your key strategies? What were your tactics? What did you learn about how to deliver a great cold call that led to these, to your point, right? You're trying to get the interest and engagement, the attention and the interest. If I'm doing AIDI in the right sequence of these executives, you have to say something compelling. You have to be engaging, and then you've got to get a meeting. How did you do it?
Yeah, I mean, I really tried to, I tried to get as educated as I could to sound like a credible person that they'd be willing to engage with and hear me out long enough to compel them to take a meeting with the account executive. And so that meant getting smart on our research and insights so that I could, call up a CFO and say, let me tell you why, 30 or 60-minute meeting with this executive is going to be worthwhile. And so I think it was leading with content and insights that were enough to get our foot in the door. I do think, all joking aside, I think the persistence was paramount. I think being a BDR is probably one of the toughest jobs in the world, in the sales world. And so being super persistent, also being creative, I was calling in off hours and also building relationships with the executive assistants and trying to find new and creative ways in. And then, of course, we had email, wasn't that far back, but just trying to make sure that I was always following up with a touch point in the next step. In fact, I used to be quite good I'd call, and if I got a voicemail, I would continue to leave a couple of politely persistent voicemails and just inform them that I'd continue to call until I heard back from them. And so, sometimes they would preempt with a response and we'd schedule a meeting, or they'd politely let me know that they weren't interested. So I think it was a combination of, let's lead with insights, make it something that's compelling and that there'll be some value in the meeting for them, and then just being willing to pick up the phone 1,000 times.
That's awesome. That's fantastic. And so I presume you were promoted into an account executive role and then on up into leadership positions. Walk us through sort of like the rest of the journey?
Yeah, it actually was slightly different. I had a very strange first year out of undergrad into this job. The manager of the BDR team that I was a part of left the company, and for some reason I'm still not quite sure I understand, they decided to put me in the role. And so I think I was only 6 or 8 months out of school and having been a BDR, and I became the manager of my peer group, which for anyone that's done it before can be one of the hardest leadership transitions to make, especially for someone who is so new to the workforce. I made all the classic mistakes of, we were all friends, probably out to happy hour the night before. And then the next day I show up in my new job and it's like a totally different person shows up at the office. I put on my manager mask and, and think that I'm supposed to be a different version of myself. And you can imagine how that played out. So it was a lot of lessons early in what not to do as a leader, but eventually figured it out. And I stayed in that role for, a year and a half or 2 years. I really enjoyed it, but I'm being really honest, I really wanted to get paid to travel. And so I really wanted to be an account executive. And so after I did the leadership role for a year or two, I interviewed to become an account executive myself. And then that's when I got into my first true sales role where I was carrying a quota.
You said something, you said all the typical mistakes, but I think there's probably people out there that don't know what all those typical mistakes are. And you're right, when you're promoted above a group of peers, it's really challenging sometimes. Now that you've done it, it's amazing that you were in that leadership position just so early out of school, which is fantastic experience. What did you learn? And, what were the mistakes that you made? And what do you know, or what do you teach people at this point to do differently than the decisions that you made?
Yeah, well, listen, there have been many versions of the story across my career, so I'm sure we'll touch on some other mistakes in a bit. But I think that two that I'll just highlight that were very clear things that I would have done differently if I could, redo this all again. The first is this idea that I thought I was supposed to be a different person or literally show up differently, because yesterday I was a rep and today I'm your manager. And so I became more closed off I stopped relating to people in the way that we had the day before when we were friends. I think I put on a very professional veneer that, everyone's sort of calling bullshit on. Like, we know you, we like you, we're friends with you. Why are you acting like this? So I think that was mistake number one. I would not recommend that anyone try to show up as anything other than who they actually are. And just because you're in an individual contributor role one day and move into leadership the next does not mean you're supposed to show up as an entirely different person. So that's one.
That's good feedback.
Yeah. The second is that CEB was really, really great at driving sales process, and there was a really predictable model and for how to advance a deal through the different stages. And, it was really more science. There's a lot of art, but there was a lot of science to how we drove revenue. And I got to be really good at driving the science. And, if you get too maniacally focused on driving the inputs and the metrics of the business, and you forget to focus on the people, that's also a recipe for disaster. And so I really had to figure out a better balance of not focusing exclusively on the performance, but focusing on the people. And that'll be a theme that we'll probably touch on a few times throughout this conversation. But it's something that I also did, totally backwards in the early days.
And so meaning sort of like all of your one-on-ones and your group meetings, you're just talking about number of calls, number of attempts, all these things, and never saying, how are you doing?
That's right.
It's good feedback. So now in the story of Alyssa, we're now an account executive traveling the world for CEB. Walk us through, so what happened next? And I think to the point, although you already made that leap, you made that leap from being a BDR to a BDR manager, then you became an account executive. But at some point you fully committed to management and leadership probably, or were asked to by management. So talk to us about the jump from account executive to leading teams and what you've learned along the way.
Yeah. So I did the AE role for a number of years, and I did get to travel all over the world. It was the wonderful early days where we got to kind of cherry pick the territory, and I got to do Australia and New Zealand, and it was such a fun time and great learning experiences. And then I also got to go to London for 2 years as an expat, and so then I was based in London selling all over Europe, Scandinavia, and South Africa. And so, gosh, what a wonderful combination of great professional experience. I think even more importantly, incredible life experience. So that was just a wonderful period of life and had so much fun. Although I will say that on the professional side, I found it really challenging to be a petite American female trying to sell to European financial executives. That was not my strongest performance as an AE over there. It was really tough, but it was great. Just great learning and great experience. But I probably like a lot of us, when you're a high performer and, you're a good team member, you often get tapped on the shoulder, asked to do the player coach thing where you're managing your own book of business, but also coaching or developing other reps. And then that morphed into just larger and larger responsibility over time. And I remember when I came back from London, there was an opportunity to work for a really great girlfriend of mine who was leading our mid-market division. And she said, I'd love for you to come back and be a leader on my team, but I want you to sell for the first quarter and learn this part of the business and also prove to the reps that you've got the chops to do it, because they don't know you. You've been gone for a couple of years. And I have to say that I thought I was very annoyed by it, but by the way, at the time, but in retrospect, it was one of the best ways to help me really walk in the shoes of the team that I'd be leading, and also build incredible credibility by being able to show them that I could do the very job that I was asking them to do. And so that was something I did for a quarter, and then took on just full responsibility for leading the team without the personal quota of my own individual sales number outside of the teams, and did that for a few years, and then ended up taking over more and more responsibility for a couple of our different practice areas. So that means I expanded out from, at this time it was selling to general counsel, then into the CIO suite, and then went on to take over, in addition, the account management team. So that was the renewals and expansion business as well. So it was a great experience. It was a really fun time. And then I made a personal decision to move to New York City, where we didn't have an office.
Fair enough. You're not here anymore, unfortunately. We are here waiting for your return. And so the move to New York, was that coinciding with joining LinkedIn?
Well, it sort of led there, but it wasn't the impetus. I was after living in London for a couple of years. I mean, I feel like there are only so many cities in the world that hold a candle to London, and New York felt like the place that I wanted to be. And I remember I went into the office of our chief revenue officer, who I knew quite well, and I said, "Listen, I love this company, but I'm going to make a personal decision to move to New York, and if that means that I need to quit, I'm happy to do that. If it means I need to move back into an IC role, I'll do that. I'm open to anything, but I'm not staying in DC." And so and he said, "Well, let's give the remote leadership thing a try." And at the time, it was about probably 25 people across a couple of different teams. And so I moved to New York and did that for a year, and it was actually probably one of our top performing years. I don't know what that means about my leadership, but having me further away was really helpful.
Means you believe in autonomy
and
letting your people do what they need to do.
There we go. That's exactly right. So it was great. It went really well. And in fact, I got an offer to then, we were in discussions about me leading the entire mid-market division, but it meant moving back to Washington. And I just said, it's just not in the cards right now. And that's where LinkedIn came along. A really good friend that I had met in New York, her brother-in-law happened to work at LinkedIn, and he wanted to check a reference with someone that I worked with at CEB. And as he was doing the reference check with me, he said, "By the way, we're always looking for good people." And I said, "Well, I appreciate that, but I'm not interested." And then I had coincidentally just at this kind of same period of time, I'd had just a networking coffee with the CEO who was giving me some career advice, and he said, "If you're probably at a point in your career at CEB, this was probably 8 or 9 years in." He said, "You either need to double down and be there for the duration, or it's probably time to go do something else. But you're going to get stale unless you've decided that this is where you want to be. It's going to start to be hard over time for you to go do other things." And so I remember hanging up the phone on that reference check conversation and then thinking back about that coffee chat with the CEO and thinking, maybe I shouldn't be so dismissive. So I called him back and I said, "Listen, I'm not necessarily interested in interviewing, but let's have a conversation and so I can learn more." And it turned out that LinkedIn this was the early days, pre-IPO, and it was one of those absolutely crazy on paper conversations because running the mid-market division at CEB was going to be 100 people. I don't know, it was $50 or $100 million business. The role at LinkedIn that we were talking about was frontline managing 5 people.
And yet,
here I am, 8 years later.
That is awesome. And through some just absolutely incredible growth. I mean, it's been amazing. I have a question. So you referenced it. You mentioned the concept of a player coach. A lot of me and other folks that I talk to are always debating the player coach. Most of the people I know are coming down and saying it doesn't work, and that you kind of need to make a commitment as an executive team to either put somebody in a management position or make them an individual contributor. What's your point of view?
I'm mixed. I mean, having done it myself, I appreciate how hard it is to do it well. And I think it's really hard, at least in the way that I experienced it, because usually you end up with the largest personal quota in addition to the responsibility of managing a couple of other folks, which is perhaps there are better ways to structure it. If you want to invest in coaching and developing other people and helping them to be successful, perhaps I should take a little bit less on in my personal quota, because it just makes it really hard to know if you're paying me and measuring my success based on my personal number, and yet you really want me to do the coaching and development. It's really hard to figure out that balance, and it in some ways is in really direct conflict. And so I think that my experience was kind of good because it at least gave me some exposure to what it would be like to coach and manage others, but it was really tough, and I probably didn't do it very well. So I think in theory I don't love it. I will say though, we're in a position right now where I've got about 40 plus leaders on my team, and there are a few more people that are really interested in leadership but aren't quite ready, or we don't have a job available, a role opening for them yet. And so I'm entertaining in a couple of places to this idea of doing a player coach role, creating one for them. This is a stretch opportunity, but recognizing that it may not be ideal, but if they're really passionate about leadership and I just don't have something for them quite yet, let's try to be thoughtful about how we construct it in a way that it can be more successful than what I experienced and probably what a lot of us have experienced.
I think that's it's a great perspective. So you have 40 leaders on your team. From my experience, often there's a jump in skill set that's required to be an individual contributor to be a manager, but then there's a whole nother jump in skill set to be a manager of other managers. What have you learned, or what perspectives have you developed on how to be, an effective boss that is overseeing a large organization? If you have 40 leaders, you must have, a couple hundred people in your go-to-market organization. What do you do? What are your strategies? What are your tactics for leadership when it comes to leading a team that large?
Yeah, I mean, it's been a journey of lots of learning. I think once you get into leadership, no matter what the scale is, and no matter how many people are working under you, you realize very quickly that you no longer have control. So I think it starts with, recognizing that you can influence and you can guide, but you can't control the outcomes in the same way that you could as an individual contributor. So I think that was a really important first and early lesson for me, is recognizing that. And then it begs the question, so what do you do? And I think that's where you've got to be able to cast a vision, and more importantly than even figuring out the right vision is figuring out how to bring people along. And so helping them understand the why of the things that you're asking the team to focus on, or the what's in it for them. And so there's, I think, a lot of what I would just characterize as change management that is one of the most important aspects of leading a team and leading leaders. There's also this theme around finding opportunities for observation. I think one of the things that I recognized pretty early on that was really hard was the further you get, especially if you're not co-located with your direct reports, it's really hard to understand how they're actually doing, because you don't get to sit in a room and observe them, or you're not on calls together where you can shadow. And so you've got to create opportunities, whether it's shadowing team meetings or shadowing one-on-ones, which can be a little awkward, but finding some moments where you can really see how's my team showing up, and how are they doing, and how can I make sure that I'm giving them the coaching and development that they need. So you want to find that right balance of, enough distance on autonomy, but also enough opportunities for observation so that you can help make sure that they're doing the right things in the right ways, and that you're helping them get better. So those are a couple of things that I've learned.
Yeah. And one of to the point of, we're now later in the conversation, but one of the things that you mentioned, and in fact, I was, we were chatting offline about this article that you wrote about sort of your first, I don't know if it was your day or your first formal review, your first 360 review at LinkedIn. And you mentioned a similar challenge, which is that you weren't bringing your whole self to work. And I know that leadership development and personal development is a really is a passion of yours and a focus of yours. How do you bring your whole self to work? What do you say to people that are worried, exactly to your point about when they're promoted above their peers? They're worried that they're going to be taken advantage of. They're worried that they're going to lack credibility. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, so I think I decided actually this week that this is probably the most important work I do. More important than trying to achieve the outcomes, more important than all of the success that we want to have is actually focusing on the individual development and in creating an environment where our teams can thrive. And so, yeah, I mean, early in my career at LinkedIn, when I came over from CEB, and I had 8 years of history there and reputation and relationships, and I came into a new company, hard charging, wanting to make an impact, and in that first 360, I got basically hit in the face with like the hardest feedback I've ever gotten, which is basically like your team thinks you're robotic and they think you're robotic. They don't relate to you. And there are certain teams that would go into battle for you, and your team would not go into battle for you. And it's a really, really tough message to receive, especially after having been in sales leadership for a number of years. And again, on paper, having taken the job I could do in my sleep. And so that was a real wake up call for me about, it's not all about outcomes. It's all about the people. And I had to do a lot of self-reflection and try to figure out, what was I doing? How was I showing up every day in the office, in meetings, in my conversations with my team, that was keeping them feeling so disconnected from me and making them feel like I didn't care about them. And so it took a while. It takes a while to dig yourself. Well, first to figure out what it is that you're doing that's creating that environment. And then secondly, to figure out how to fix it, because some people are more forgiving than others. And so I think that was probably the most poignant moment in my career that redefined for me what leadership was all about. And I intellectually knew it's important to care about your people, but I had never experienced such a stark contrast between what I knew to be true and what I was actually doing and what my team was experiencing. And so it led to, I'd say, probably the last 7 or 8 years, a body of work that I have been focused on, which is how can I ensure that the people that are part of my organization are better for having worked with me. And that doesn't mean necessarily just being soft and warm and fuzzy and nice to each other. It means how do we get to a place where we have so much trust and so much care for each other that we can get real and we can have really tough conversations in the spirit of pushing each other to get better and growing. And so, implementing things like fast feedback when we see something that isn't up to the standard or that we don't agree with, we call it out. We don't hide it. We don't beat around the bush. We have a conversation about it.
Is it a private conversation or a public conversation?
Yeah, interesting. You should ask. Many people may cringe at the thought of this, but oftentimes it's in public. And I don't mean calling someone out on the floor, but when we get together as a leadership team, we do some pretty intensive sessions around how we're showing up. And that's often in a group of, could be 5 to 8 to 10 people at a time. And we're sitting around the room and everyone's providing feedback in all directions. And that means I'm getting feedback in front of my team. I'm also giving it to them. And oftentimes it's skip level too. So it might be, I'll participate with one of my direct reports teams. And so it creates a really interesting dynamic of, not everyone's super comfortable, but I will say that the feedback I've gotten has been, it's just sort of heartwarming. You get, no one likes it in the moment, but I think once people step away and reflect and look at the growth that they've had because of some of the moments of self-awareness and the feedback that they've gotten, many of them have said, I hadn't in my career had that kind of growth and I haven't had that investment since. And I think that gives me a lot of comfort, even in the moments when everyone's sort of cringing that we're having to have these sessions. So it's a little bit of both. And of course you give feedback in private as well when it's warranted.
This is me personally to the point of getting real. My fear about that I guess I would just have to trust that the organization is not so trigger happy around firing people that the feedback is genuine and that the commitment to improvement is genuine and that I have enough time to work on it. Do you find that you need to reassure people that we're giving you feedback, but your job's not on the line. We just want you to get better and you're going to have time to improve. How do you structure the natural tension between being called out in public on something that you need to improve with the underlying fears about job security?
Yeah, I don't know that I've ever explicitly called that out, but I actually think so. I think there's an important step before we get straight into feedback, which is creating a safe environment and demonstrating vulnerability. And so I think what that would look like is if I were kicking off the session, I would share with the team how I'm feeling. I would share it might be, I'm sharing something that's going on personally. It could run the gamut, but it's demonstrating that as the leader, I'm willing to put my own feelings, emotions, insecurities out there. And I'm creating the space and setting the tone for the kind of conversation that I want to have. And by the way, I wouldn't do that if I didn't care. And so I think you can't just launch into feedback in front of a group of people without having the foundations of trust and vulnerability. And so that's a really important, I think, first step. And I also talk about, I frame this for the team that teams where there's no trust, everyone's really nice to each other. It's only the teams where there's real trust that we can start to have these kinds of conversations. And then, I think I'm sure that there is some fear and insecurity with when we start to have these sort of exposing conversations. But at the same time, I think we've got enough of a track record of being really thoughtful and investing in the individual and giving them time and space to improve that, I don't think I've ever actually let someone go because of the stuff that's come up in these conversations. So if it's gone that way, it's probably been a mutual decision that this just isn't the right environment or the right kind of growth that they're interested in. So, I think we're doing okay, but it's a really good call. It may be something I'll think about for the next one.
I don't mean to second guess you. I have another question, which is something that you wrote about actually in the blog post that you have up on LinkedIn around that tough 360 that you got in your first period. And it said, you mentioned something about focusing on people's strengths and enhancing their strengths versus focusing them on trying to correct weaknesses or areas for improvement. So in that spirit, I'm also curious about your perspective on feedback in general, and how changeable are people? How do you structure feedback to make it as useful and as practical and as actionable as possible? And do you find that it's sometimes trying to get somebody to correct a weakness is the wrong emphasis, but maybe it's let's try and enhance their strengths and get the most out of them? So I'm sort of leading the witness, but what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I guess that came from a place when that whole thing happened. I realized that what I had been doing, when I came into LinkedIn, and it was so easy to identify that everything was wrong because I was coming from a really tight sales operation. I mean, I think CEB was one of the most well-run sales organizations that I can imagine, and LinkedIn was again, early days, very entrepreneurial, not a lot of process. It was so easy to figure out what everyone needed to fix, and where I could fix everyone. And I think that was just this realization I had of, wow, that's such a crummy way to look at your people. and then I had to learn from one of our leaders, Dan Shapiro, who had this perspective of, you can certainly try to go fix people, but wouldn't it be more powerful if you can help them improve, find the one thing that if they can go from good to great, or the one thing that they can make progress on, that might actually be more impactful than going and trying to fix something that somewhere somebody doesn't have that capability. So I think it depends what we're talking about too. If you're not making enough, outreach, and you're not out visiting customers enough, that's a different kind of feedback and coaching than let's figure out how to help you with your negotiation or closing skills and going from okay to great. So I think it depends on what we're talking about. But I think in general with the feedback, I've always been a really big proponent of, let's find the one thing, not the 10 things. And I think many managers tend to find it's like flavor of the week. You pick one thing this week and one thing next week. But I think what's a lot more effective is to pick the one thing that really is going to be needle moving, and then let's stay on that theme until you make progress. And that's where I think feedback can be most effective. And that's, I think, to answer your original question, yes, I think people can change as long as you're really clear about what the behavior or the skill is, and you stay focused on it until there's progress.
And do you feel like every piece of feedback does it need to be correlated to something that you can measure so that it can be clear to the individual what the feedback is related to?
No, I probably give a lot more feedback on a lot of the soft skills. And, maybe this is because I'm, mostly focused these days on leadership development, but I'll give you an example. We have a relatively new leader in the team, and she's wonderful. She's so great and has so many great things to share. But in a group setting, she is really reticent to speak up. And when she has, in a couple of occasions, she's sort of given away all of her power. It's rather meek. It's rather kind of quiet and under her breath. And so I called her after one of the meetings, and I said, I really appreciate that you spoke up. And I really want you to be conscious of your tone and your volume and your projection, because you're either giving away power or owning your power in that moment. And so that's not, neither of us can measure that per se, but we can both be conscious of improvement from what the baseline was. And she's great. And now she checks in with me after meetings, and we can kind of assess for that, the progress she's making. So that's an example of something that's, much more on the softer side.
Yeah, no, makes sense. So if we're thinking about, to your point, a skill, something that you're passionate about is building high performing sales teams. And part of it is creating an atmosphere of trust and vulnerability that starts from the top. Part of it is fast feedback. What are the other tenets that you think are really, really critical if we're going to build a team that excels?
Yeah. So I have not talked about this before because I haven't until this week. It's not something that I've really experienced before. But this week, my direct reports and I did a North America roadshow. Each day we went across to one of our different offices and spent less than 24 hours in each city doing, kind of an all hands rally cry. Let's finish out Q4 strong and get excited for next year. But we also decided to add a couple of breakout sessions that was sort of characterizing as more humanistic. And they were conversations, just real, what I would characterize as real talk, real conversations that we're not used to having about the fears and the insecurities and anxiety that we all experience every day, but we don't talk about. And so one of those sessions was, how can we have an honest conversation about how we're feeling, the stress and anxiety? For us, it's Q4 right now. And then how can we better balance and manage our emotional hygiene and stress? So that was one. We had another topic where a couple of my direct reports and I talked about what our hours are, how hard we work, how long we work, what our days look like, in the spirit of trying to demystify what I think can be very intimidating jobs. Because I'd had a couple of chats with reps who said they wouldn't necessarily want a job like mine because they wanted to have a family. And I thought that was so upsetting that they felt like they couldn't have both. And so we wanted to be able to have a real conversation about how do we get it all done and juggle it all. And, and the reality is that in some cases, the more senior you get, it's not like you necessarily work longer hours. You spend your time differently and you spend your energy differently. And so that was another conversation. But the last one, which was the most powerful, and I think is the work that I'm probably going to throw myself into most wholeheartedly, is a conversation that we called removing your mask. And, there's a lot of conversation today about diversity, inclusion, and belonging. And that's a huge theme at LinkedIn. And I think we've done a great job in a lot of ways. And there's a long road ahead for us to really be creating an environment where everyone feels like they can be their full, true, authentic selves at work. And so we had reps from across the country in each of these cities sharing their experience of what it's like to come to work every day wearing a mask. And I'll just give you a couple quick examples. In one case, it was a woman who was recently sober, and she feels like she has to wear a mask every day when, you're popping champagne to celebrate quota crossing, or somebody's promotion, you're going to happy hour, and what her experience of the world is. Or someone who suffers from anxiety and depression. We had another one she's a member of our team who's a lesbian, and to talk about her experience of the world and what that's like, and actually how isolating it is because she feels so different and everyone else feels that she's so different. And so it's like, even though we have this incredible, loving, warm, caring culture, there are individuals and we all have stuff that we're dealing with in our lives. And I think that this idea of creating an environment where it's okay to talk about it might be the most transformative thing that we can do for a lot of these individuals. And I think for me, I'm a lot more focused right now on investing and creating a space for the humans on our team, the people. And I think when you can create that kind of connection, that's when you build followership, and that's where you inspire people, and that's where they feel connected to the mission and the vision of what we're doing, and they'll go, run through walls for you. And so I think that's a long answer to your short question, but that to me, I think, is the work around building high-performing teams these days.
Is there a book we should read or somebody we should hire? Should we get you as a guest speaker if we want to do something practical and immediate to start installing and implementing, some of what you're talking about?
Well, I think I will write a book about this at some point. I think there is. I mean, this is. I've never experienced this, and the people in the room yesterday and this week have said, I've been working for 25 years and I've never had this kind of conversation at work. I think there is an opportunity to start a movement for all of us to create these kinds of open and safe spaces. So I don't know that there's necessarily a playbook for that conversation, other than seeing, maybe test it out to see if that's, take a few members of your organization and see if they're interested in having a conversation and sharing their story. Because, by the way, what happened after those panels was the most exciting part of all of it is all of these people started to share their versions with each other and their stories, and feeling connected and feeling safe in a very different way. So that's, maybe one is just go experiment. I will say that I think there's an amazing book called The Advantage that talks a lot about some of the feedback and building great leadership teams. Are you familiar with that book?
I am indeed, Mr. Lencioni.
Of course. I think it's such a great, I would say more like hand guide or practical guide to handbook of how to actually do some of this stuff in practice. Maybe not what I just described, which is certainly a bit more personal, but on the team building and leadership development and creating trust, I think that's probably one of the best books that I've seen out there. How about you? Do you have any others that you'd recommend?
What a great question. Well, my favorite book on leadership, which I talk about all the time, is this book, First Break All the Rules, which is it's got like, I think 12 steps, 12 sort of sequential questions that have to be answered to build a really high performing team. That's one. And the first question that must be answered is, do I know what's expected of me? That is you have to be able to answer that question on behalf of, the people that work for you if you want them to do something, of course. So that's one. And to your point about Lencioni, the 5 dysfunctions of a team is, like the starting point for a lot of people as they dive into some of this stuff. And I found that really, really interesting, really helpful.
Yeah, I need to go read. I read The Advantage. I haven't read the 5 dysfunctions, but I'll add it to the list.
There you go. Alyssa, it's been amazing to have you on the show. One of the things we like to do right at the very end is pay it forward a little bit and hear about people that have influenced you that you think highly of, that you think we should know about. So if you're thinking about influences, mentors, people that you really look up to and respect, who are some of those folks that have played a pivotal role in your life?
Yeah, well,
professionally speaking.
Yeah, I was going to focus on the professional. There are 2 that come to mind immediately, and the first is a very, very dear friend, and the woman who hired me into that mid-market role after I was coming back from London, and that's Susan Miller. I feel like she took the first real shot on me as a leader and invested so deeply and was so great at being real and coaching me, and also giving me just amazing stretch roles and opportunities before anyone else was willing to do it. And so, Susan, love you and thank you. And she's amazing. And she's now the CRO of a really cool company. And then the second would be Pete Kim, who is the one who hired me at LinkedIn and who gave me all that really tough feedback that almost broke my soul. But it also is, I think, single-handedly responsible for transforming my career, because without the experience of working for him and to know what it feels like for someone to care so deeply about you that they're willing to take you to a deep, dark place that you need to go face, I wouldn't be the leader that I am today. So just 2 people that I will have in my life forever, and I can't say enough great things about.
Awesome. Alyssa, if people want to reach out to you after hearing what you've shared and are inspired by it, or they just want to work for you, are you open to that? What's your preferred channel of communication? How should people reach out if they want to?
Yes, well, as Pete said to me, we're always hiring great people. So I love for folks to reach out if any of what I shared doesn't scare you away. LinkedIn is the best place to reach me. So that I welcome any and all that outreach that way. It'd be great.
Awesome. And for those, it's probably in the show notes or in the title, but it's Alyssa, Alyssa, and then Merwin, Merwin. And I'm sure you can find her on LinkedIn. Alyssa, thanks so much for being on the show. It's been fantastic to have you.
Thank you.
Hey folks, Sam Jacobs. It's Sam's Corner. That was a fantastic conversation with Alyssa. Just a lot of really important insights about the skills, the personal, the human connection skills that are required to be a great leader and a great manager. And we talked about a lot of different subjects and aspects of this idea, but one of them she mentioned, and if you're out there listening and you've just been promoted to be manager and you're now managing a team of people that used to be your peers, don't make these mistakes. One of the things that Alyssa said is the next day when she was at Corporate Executive Board, and she was promoted from SDR to SDR, BDR is what the title was then, to BDR manager. She said she came in and she put on her boss face, and she was determined to be the boss, and she was probably a little bit more remote. She was a little bit tougher, probably trying to act and walk with authority in a way that she thought might imply credibility. And it doesn't work. It doesn't work if people know who you are and you're automatically acting like somebody different. So don't put on airs when you're a manager or a leader. You have to embrace all sides of yourself. People respond to authenticity. They respond to real connection, real interpersonal relationships. And so the more that you're sort of acting like what you think the idea of a boss is supposed to be, I think the less effective you're going to be in this modern world. And I think Alyssa really drives that home. One of the things she talked about is the conditions for a high-performing sales team. One of them is that you have to be able to receive feedback. And the way that you are able to receive feedback is if the leader and the manager is creating an environment of trust and intimacy. And so if you are out there, you have to lead first by being vulnerable yourself as a leader. And you have to make sure that you create a zone of psychological safety, that it's okay for people to be themselves. Some of the most important work that Alyssa was talking about that she's now emphatic about, it's the first time she shared it, is about this concept of these workshops where people were removing their mask and talking about what it's like for them to come to work every day and what their personal issues were. She mentioned somebody that's going through recovery, that, that person obviously doesn't feel included if every celebration is going to be about alcohol. And that's just one example. So really creating a zone of psychological safety. And that's what enables you to give tough feedback, because people understand that you're not against them. You're not out to get them. You're not doing it because you're trying to be big boss person. You're doing it because you care about them. You have to deliver feedback compassionately, but if you can do that compassionately, you can really see results. People respond. It resonates with people. So be yourself. That is the lesson of Sam's Corner. Now, before we go, we of course want to thank our sponsors. We've got two sponsors, Conga, which is the leading end-to-end digital document transformation suite, and Outreach. Outreach is the leading sales engagement platform. As I mentioned at the top of the show, if you haven't rated the show on iTunes, please do so. We would love your 4 or 5-star ratings, and we really appreciate your feedback. If you want to get in touch with me, you always can. It's linkedin.com/Sam F. Jacobs. Happy to tell you more about Revenant Collective, which is my life's work. Happy to tell you more about the show, and happy to receive feedback on the show. So thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you next time.